Um, I was an acquaintance of Jimmy Baldwin's, not a close friend, and I knew him in a setting that often isn't discussed uh, about him, which is the kind of life that he led in Paris, and that's where I saw him pretty much whenever I was in Paris, and he happened to be in Paris. I met him through our mutual friend William Styron, and I didn't look him up when I first went to Paris in the '60s, but we just happened to meet at a party. So what I can tell you about his life in exile is not, um, uh, deeply revealing of him, but I hope I can give you a sense of what it was like for him to be abroad and the kinds of experiences that he seemed to be having. I think the most important fact about Jimmy's time in Paris was that it was a release from the tensions he felt in America about being a gay black man. And in Paris, the fact of him being gay was a kind of neutral um, event. That was quite surprising for him. People really didn't care much one way or the other in the circles in which he traveled. Um, those circles seemed to me to be, there were two of them. One was other African Americans who had moved to Paris simply because they found conditions in the U.S. Personally intolerable. And the other circle he moved in was a much more cosmopolitan and mixed group of people who included a fair number of Africans who had studied in Paris, gone to Paris to launch their literary careers, or were people who were involuntary exiles to Paris from their home countries. And I think that was I knew many of those people. I knew for different reasons. I knew them through Claude Lévi-Strauss, who had kept a contact with the African as well as Latin American exile community in Paris. I think for Jimmy, he was just kind of doubly disoriented. In a way, the issue of being gay became a non-issue relatively for him in Paris. And he'd written a wonderful novel called Giovanni's Room, which was a novel about one of the first novels really to try and probe the condition of being gay in America. And it says, I remember a novel in which race doesn't figure. Is that right?
That's right.
That's what I remember.
But it does. It's everywhere and nowhere.
It's everywhere and nowhere. Yeah. But aren't all the characters white?
They're all white, except for Giovanni is a different kind of white. He's Italian, So there's this idea of a certain kind of American innocence that Baldwin shatters through the journey of the characters.
Right. Yeah. That comes back to me. Well, imagine he comes to Paris, and writers like Gilles René Crevel. There's a whole tradition of gay writing in Paris, and these are writers that are deeply respected by the French reading public. So that, in a way, I think was, as far as I could tell, something that he was having to take on board. I once asked him about it. I said, what does it feel like? And he said, well, it's a relief not to have to keep a secret, of course. But also when we keep a secret, I never forget this, he said, when we keep a secret, of course, we value what we are keeping secret. So, which is always true. This cosmopolitan milieu that included a lot of involuntary exiles was a problem for him, I think, because many of the people in it had almost a kind of reflex reaction to America. That it was a place that was really the seat of the oppressor, the new colonialist, that its culture was crass and commercial. And many Americans in Paris, particularly in the early 60s, had to deal with, on the one hand, the French crazed love of American popular culture, and on the other hand, the French almost crazed hatred of anything that smacked of American power. And I think that the comings and goings that Jimmy had from the U.S. to the back to Paris were like going. When he went back to the U.S., he suddenly entered into a world in which everything mattered, in which all the issues were, the race and domination were up for grabs. And when he went to Paris, people thought, well, it's not so important. This is just a place, America is oppression. And the things that French people liked about American culture were hardly the sorts of things to get him going. Jerry Lewis was almost demigod in the 60s, cultural demigod in the 60s in Paris, was not somebody that Jimmy would, I think, point to as a source of respect. So as happens with many exiles, that once they find that they're able to leave, particularly if they're voluntary exiles, the reflection on the value of what's they've left, of what's pushed them out, becomes greater. There's an old story in the history of exile. Herzen, for instance, the 19th century Russian socialist who was exiled from Russia, said he became in a way more Russian abroad than he was at home. And you can understand that dynamic, and it's something that I think really tugged at Jimmy. I never went to the south of France where he had a house, but I gather that was again a kind of odd displacement, because his house was in what was at that time really rural France. And the one thing about Jimmy is he was a man of the city. He liked pavements, he liked streets, that's where he grew up, and so it was a retreat, but it was, kind of double retreat once again from where he was. I think maybe one sense I had, I was talking to a friend of mine who was a Nigerian playwright who saw more of Jimmy regularly in Paris than I did, because I was coming and going between New York and Paris in those years. And my Nigerian friend said to me that something that bothered him about Jimmy is that it was very hard to get Jimmy as interested in what was happening in Africa as he expected my Nigerian friend to be interested in what was happening in the U.S. And I don't think that's a failing on Jimmy's part. I think it's just that he really hadn't left in that decisive, life-changing way. Just give you a kind of detail of what I would see him at parties. Um, I never felt of course, there's always this, racial mutual awareness. But we both spoke French, and his French was pretty good, and so was mine. And that's again another strange thing. Two Americans abroad speaking the, foreign language, both in this sort of way saying, well, we're not really the people we were at home. And I've often wondered about, and perhaps you can tell me this, whether something happened as a result of his becoming his French was very evocative, whether something happened to his English as a result. Whether you think that in some way, being able to speak as it were outside the circumstances of his oppression and his struggles changed the kind of language that he used when he returned to those sites. I don't know. It's always something.
I think that's interesting. I guess, Baldwin, I won't call him Jimmy, was always global in his imagination. That's the title of the conference. Reading Henry James and everybody he could get his hands on. You know what I mean? So I'm thinking that kind of impulse to another language is kind of common. I'm not sure it turns up in the writing. I can't really mark it for myself.
You don't think there's a change in diction after he starts going to Paris? Or in the sentence rhythms? No, I was thinking of it at that level.
Yeah.
Just at the craft level.
I'm thinking about that. I'm not sure. I would have to do more kind of thinking about it, more close reading around it.
I wondered about it.
But I think the kind of, what you find in his early essays, in his reviews, is that same kind of grandness that we can't, lay at the French's door, Richard.
Yeah. Yeah, he always had that. There were people that Jimmy knew much better than me who came to France frequently, most notably Bill Styron. And I think that those were important meetings for him. I think that he suffered a fair degree of loneliness for the reasons that I've described in France. I've heard other writers of his generation say, well, he was somebody who was always bemoaning, that he had a measure of self-pity. I never heard that. But I think what he did have was an enormous longing to not have to be in Paris. That this came on him as a result of pressures that were really overwhelming, for which there was a solution. It's the same longing I feel in Richard Wright, for an impossible homeland. And when people like Styron would come, it was just, he felt suddenly, he could stop being, as it were, displaced abroad. So, I think it's, the reason I ask you this about the diction is I've often wondered what difference France made to the person we know, the public figure we know.
Yeah.
And I think it's rather hard to read.
I guess the thing I would say just very quickly is that Baldwin talks about leaving France, having a breakdown, going with Lucien to the South, right? And taking with him Bessie Smith and company as a way to give him the key to the language that gave him Goat Out in the Mountain. And so it seems to me that this idea of, we talk about exile, of taking your home with you, wherever you go. You're more American abroad. And so Baldwin, in order for him to kind of excavate and mine the torment and the details that sent him running away to France. He didn't leave America, he went to France, what he says.
That's right.
It's precisely because, he had to excavate, like I said before, that, nigger within. Yeah. And I think that's where he locates, I think, his movement from being a kind of writer that does certain things that writers do to a very serious, ambitious literary figure.
Right.
You know?
Do you think the same thing was true for Richard Wright, or has that got a different configuration?
I think the trajectory is different. I think the trajectory is different. Richard Wright was equally as menaced as James Baldwin here, but I think there's a fair amount of paranoia later on in Richard's life, and that makes it hard to kind of sort out. I mean, James Campbell writes about this in Exile in Paris.
Uh-huh.
But yeah, I think they're part of that milieu, you know what I mean, of mid-century American writers in France, Chester Himes, Richard Wright.
Right.
And the beat folk, you know, so.
Yeah. Although I think homosexuality made a big difference for this. That's something
Absolutely.
very particular for Jimmy. That was hard for him to. I mean, one thing he told me is he said it's really hard to talk to other black men about being gay. Well, he didn't use the word gay, but being a fag. And I think it weighed on him, that it was a kind of profound sexual alienation from other black writers in that era, African American writers in exile. It's so easy to talk to I mean, it was a very curious situation for him. Okay. It's just a very people in Paris not so much read him as read about him. I think it's fair to say. The books of his that are translated into French are badly translated. They're very clunky. But he was a known figure, and in the places like the bar of the Hotel Montalembert, he was somebody, they knew this was a personnage, he was treated as a dignitary, this was the literary bar of Paris in the 60s. But he was a kind of icon for people. Icon of somebody who had to leave that horrible, nasty country and who had embraced France enough to be able to swim in this milieu of other exiles, other intellectuals, and so on. So that's my sense of him there. I mean, when we talked one-to-one, it was usually over a drink. I don't know why we didn't become closer friends. I mean, we liked each other. It may have been if we'd spoken English rather than French, we would have progressed to friendship. But I was at that time, the last thing I wanted to do, I was one of those people who desperately wanted to get out of America, get out of the places I knew, and so on. So for me, France was also a kind of wonderful, free haven. But I hope this gives you some sense of what it was like for him. It wasn't really an escape. That's what I'm trying. It was an exile, but not an escape.
It's a good place to end. Thank you, Richard.
Yeah. Is this useful to you?
Absolutely.
Okay.
Absolutely.